Before we start the video, I need to ask for your help. This channel is new, and we really depend on your subscription to keep bringing these stories every day. If you enjoy history and classic aircraft, please subscribe to the channel and support our work. Your subscription is extremely important for us. Now, let's begin the video. After the end of the Second World War, the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk entered a strange transitional period in which its identity as a frontline fighter evaporated almost overnight. During the war, it had been one of the most widely used American fighters, serving in multiple theaters under different names and with dozens of squadrons that learned its strengths and weaknesses in the most unforgiving conditions. But when peace arrived in 1945, the United States, like the rest of the world, was flooded with thousands of surplus aircraft, and the rapid development of technology made anything designed at the beginning of the war seem instantly outdated. The P-40, which had once been a symbol of determination, ruggedness, and reliability, suddenly had to find a new purpose or risk disappearing entirely from aviation history except as museum pieces and scrapyard remnants. The question of what happened to the Curtiss P-40 after World War II is inseparable from the question of what happened to an entire generation of piston-engine fighter aircraft that had been pushed aside by the jet age before they could even complete a full peacetime career. One of the immediate consequences of the war ending was the mass demobilization of American air power. The United States Army Air Forces no longer needed the same enormous number of fighters it had relied on to defend convoys, escort bombers, and support ground operations around the world. Aircraft like the P-51 Mustang and the P-47 Thunderbolt, which had outperformed the P-40 in the later years of the war, were still considered valuable enough to keep in service. The P-40, however, had already reached the limits of its development by 1943. Its Allison engines, despite improvements, could not compete with the newer high-altitude power plants, and its airframe, though tough, was aerodynamically dated. The United States understood this, and as soon as peace was declared, the P-40 was among the first fighters to be declared surplus. Across storage fields in the American Southwest, from Kingman to Walnut Ridge to Ontario, P-40s were parked in long, silent rows, their tires deflating under the sun, their paint fading, and their engines soaked in protective oil to prevent corrosion. Some had flown dozens of missions, others had never even left the training bases. A few bore the personal art and markings of pilots who had carried them through some of the hardest battles of the early war. But bureaucracy does not respect nostalgia, and most of these aircraft were given numbers, categories, and assigned futures, sale, scrap, transfer, or cannibalization for parts. In the months following Japan's surrender, American depots began to evaluate which aircraft would be sold to Allies, which would be handed over under existing agreements, and which would simply be melted down. Despite being declared obsolete for American use, the Curtiss P-40 still had value internationally. Many developing air forces, especially those rebuilding after the destruction of the war or forming for the first time, needed inexpensive, proven fighters with easy-to-maintain engines and a reliable supply of spare parts. The Warhawk was exactly that kind of aircraft. It did not require highly specialized maintenance crews, it could operate from rough airstrips, and its rugged construction made it suitable for nations that lacked sophisticated logistical networks. As a result, the P-40 began a second life, not in American skies but across Latin America, the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and even parts of Asia. One of the regions where the P-40 had the most impact after the war was South America. Countries such as Brazil, Chile, Peru, and Argentina purchased or received Warhawks from American surplus stock in the late 1940s. These aircraft replaced older biplanes and early monoplanes that had been the backbone of their air forces. In these countries, the P-40 became an important transitional aircraft, allowing pilots to gain experience with faster, more powerful fighters before acquiring jets. Brazil, which had used the P-40 during the war in the Mediterranean theater, continued flying them into the late 1940s, using them for patrol, interception, and advanced training. Chile acquired several dozen P-40s and kept them in service long enough that they became a familiar sight to an entire generation of Chilean aviation enthusiasts. Even in nations with limited budgets, the P-40 proved relatively easy to operate because of its mechanical simplicity. Many air forces viewed it as a reliable stepping stone toward the modern era. In the Middle East, the story was similar. Egypt acquired a significant number of surplus P-40s and used them during the late 1940s, including in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Although technologically inferior to some of the aircraft fielded by opposing forces, the Warhawk was still capable of ground attack missions, patrol flights, and limited air defense duties. In the desert skies, its tough construction and ability to withstand harsh conditions earned respect. Even as Egypt transitioned to newer, more advanced fighters, the P-40 remained in secondary roles such as training and liaison duties. For a country in the early stages of building a modern air force, the Warhawk filled a critical gap at a crucial moment in history. In Europe, the fate of the P-40 varied widely from country to country. Some Eastern European nations had already operated the aircraft during the war under Lend-Lease agreements and continued to fly them for a few years afterward. However, political changes following the onset of the Cold War quickly made American-supplied aircraft undesirable or difficult to support. The Soviet Union, which had received several thousand P-40s during the war, viewed surplus American aircraft in Eastern Europe as symbols of Western influence and encouraged the adoption of Soviet fighters instead. As a result, many P-40s in that region were retired early, scrapped, or cannibalized for parts to keep a smaller number operational while waiting for newer Soviet designs like the Yak-9 or La-7 to replace them. China's story with the P-40 was more dramatic and prolonged than that of most nations. During the war, the P-40 had achieved legendary status in the hands of the American volunteer group, known as the Flying Tigers. After 1945, both the nationalist and communist Chinese factions continued using leftover P-40s in the Chinese Civil War. Because China had an enormous territory, limited industrial capacity, and an urgent need for combat aircraft, the P-40 remained valuable despite its aging design. Pilots who had grown up hearing stories about the Flying Tigers often felt a sense of pride flying the same aircraft, even if its performance was no longer competitive with newer Soviet or American models entering the region. In some remote areas, these aircraft remained in service well into the early 1950s. Their final flights in China were often not combat missions but transport, reconnaissance, or escort duties as the country transitioned to newer technologies. In the United States, meanwhile, the majority of P-40s faced a harsher fate. Within only a few years after the war, scrapyards across the country were dismantling them at an astonishing rate. Aircraft that had once represented the courage of early war pilots were cut apart by steel saws and melted down for aluminum. To modern observers, this seems almost tragic, but at the time the surplus was overwhelming. Tens of thousands of aircraft of all types had nowhere to go, and the government had little incentive to preserve them. The aviation industry was changing so quickly: jets, pressurized cabins, swept wings, that no one could predict which aircraft, if any, would be historically significant decades later. The P-40, lacking the fame of the Mustang or the unique performance of the Lightning, was seen as just another obsolete fighter. Nevertheless, a handful of enthusiasts recognized the value of these aircraft even in the late 1940s and early 1950s. A small number of P-40 airframes were purchased by private owners who intended to use them for air racing, flight demonstrations, or personal enjoyment. In the early post-war air races, where surplus fighters competed for speed, maneuverability, and spectacle, the P-40 was at a disadvantage compared to lighter, more aerodynamic aircraft. But it still appeared occasionally, its Allison engine roaring as pilots pushed it far beyond its intended limits. These private P-40s were among the first to transition from war machines to civilian-owned historic aircraft, a movement that would grow significantly in later decades. Another important chapter in the Warhawk's post-war life unfolded in the world of testing and experimentation. Several P-40s were used as testbeds for new aviation technologies. Their rugged airframes made them ideal platforms for trying out new propellers, fuel systems, and aerodynamic modifications. At a time when the industry was moving rapidly toward jets, these piston fighters provided a stable and predictable baseline for measuring improvements or validating theories. Some P-40s were used to evaluate early forms of ground attack equipment, while others played roles in the development of civilian aircraft technology. Hollywood also discovered the P-40. Because many airfields had surplus aircraft available at extremely low prices, film producers took advantage of the opportunity to use them in movies depicting the early years of World War II. Sometimes the aircraft were flown, more often they were used as static props. A few were modified to resemble other aircraft types for cinematic purposes. Although these film roles were not glamorous, they contributed to the survival of certain individual airframes that might otherwise have been scrapped. By the 1960s, the P-40 had become an increasingly rare sight. Most of the aircraft sold to foreign nations had been retired, scrapped, or lost in accidents. Many were abandoned on remote airfields, left to decay under the sun until nothing remained but corroded metal and scattered parts. Aviation historians began searching for surviving Warhawks in barns, deserts, and jungles. Some wrecks were found in remarkable condition, others were barely recognizable. The rise of the warbird restoration movement gave new hope to these forgotten aircraft. Restorers discovered that even badly damaged P-40s could be resurrected through a combination of original parts, newly manufactured components, and skilled craftsmanship. These restorations were not merely mechanical projects, they were acts of historical preservation. Each P-40 that returned to the sky carried with it the legacy of pilots who had fought in North Africa, China, the Pacific, and Europe. Warbirds flying in airshows across the United States and Europe brought the Warhawk's distinctive shape and sound back to life, allowing new generations to experience a living piece of early war aviation. As surviving aircraft became rarer, their value increased, and collectors competed to acquire and restore them. Some museums displayed P-40s with original wartime markings, while others chose to honor specific squadrons or pilots. Each aircraft told its own story. The preservation movement also led to extensive historical research. Aviation scholars interviewed former pilots, collected documents, and pieced together the movements of individual airframes. Some P-40s that appeared lost were rediscovered decades later in unexpected places. A few were recovered from lakes, swamps, or deserts, where they had crash-landed during the war and remained untouched until discovered by explorers or historians. These dramatic recoveries captured the imagination of the public and reinforced the symbolic importance of the P-40. It was not just a machine, it was a witness to one of the most turbulent periods in human history. The Warhawk's modern legacy has grown far beyond what anyone in 1945 could have predicted. Today, surviving examples are treasured artifacts flown by dedicated pilots, displayed in museums, and maintained by mechanics who view them as irreplaceable connections to the past. Although only a fraction of the thousands built still exist, each restored aircraft represents a triumph over time, neglect, and the inevitable decay that follows even the most heroic service. The P-40, once overshadowed by faster and more advanced fighters, has earned renewed respect for its historical significance and its role in the early years of the war. As the decades passed, the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk evolved from an obsolete frontline fighter into a cultural symbol whose meaning changed depending on who remembered it. For the pilots who had flown it during the early stages of the Second World War, it represented grit more than glamour. Many had struggled with its limitations in high-altitude combat but had relied on its sturdiness, firepower, and ability to survive damage that would have brought down more fragile aircraft. After the war ended, and especially after the Warhawk began disappearing from military inventories around the world, those veterans increasingly viewed the P-40 with nostalgia. They remembered its cockpit smell, its heavy control forces, the way the engine vibrated during startup, and the unique blend of confidence and vulnerability that defined every sortie. These memories, once private, gradually became part of public storytelling as veterans gave interviews and wrote memoirs. The P-40 became a symbol not of perfection but of perseverance. This emotional attachment played a major role in the aircraft's revival during the late 20th century. Air museums in the United States, Canada, Britain, Australia, and New Zealand recognized that the P-40 had been a backbone of early war efforts. Although overshadowed in later years by more advanced fighters, it had carried the burden of some of the hardest early fighting in North Africa, China, and the Pacific. Museums sought surviving examples, and many were willing to restore even severely damaged airframes. This shift in cultural attitude helped transform the P-40 from forgotten scrap into celebrated history. For countries that had used the P-40 after the war, the legacy took different forms. In South America, Older pilots told stories of their first experiences transitioning from biplanes into powerful monoplane fighters, explaining how the P-40 had shaped their Air Force's development. In places like Brazil and Chile, the aircraft became part of national aviation history, and although most airframes did not survive, the pilots' memories helped preserve the Warhawk's importance. In Egypt, where the P-40 had seen limited combat in the 1948 conflict, surviving photographs and military documents later became valuable for historians studying early Middle Eastern air warfare. In China, both communist and nationalist veterans remembered the Warhawk as a symbol of foreign assistance during a turbulent era. Some Chinese museums today display replicas or restored examples of the aircraft, referencing its long service in Chinese skies. What is remarkable about the P-40's post-war life is that its final impact was not military but cultural. For modern audiences, especially those who attend airshows or follow warbird restoration, the Warhawk has become visually iconic largely because of one detail, the shark mouth. While not all wartime P-40s carried this marking, the association is strong enough that when people imagine the aircraft, they picture rows of sharp teeth painted beneath the engine cowling. This tradition began with the Flying Tigers in China and spread to other units. When restored aircraft began returning to the skies decades later, owners almost always chose shark mouth paint schemes because they were instantly recognizable and symbolized the spirited personality of the fighter. This visual legacy became so widespread that even people who know little about military aviation can identify a P-40 by its painted mouth. In this way, the Warhawk achieved something few combat aircraft manage: it became a cultural icon independent of its technical performance. Another surprising chapter in the P-40's later life came from aviation archaeology. As the decades passed, explorers and historians discovered wrecked P-40s in remote deserts, jungles, and mountain regions. Some had made forced landings, others had simply been abandoned when they ran out of parts or fuel. In some places, these wrecks remained almost perfectly preserved due to the environmental conditions. One of the most famous cases was a P-40 discovered in the Egyptian desert, often referred to as the Kitty Hawk of the Sahara. Although found too damaged for flight restoration, it became an international sensation, reminding the world that wartime history still lay hidden beneath sand and soil. Each discovery renewed interest in the aircraft and in the pilots who had flown them, creating powerful stories about survival, loss, and the harsh realities of wartime aviation. Through all these developments, the Curtiss P-40 also became a subject of deep academic study. Engineers examining its design decades later noted how its performance limitations were tied to the era of its creation. Built before the full lessons of aerodynamic refinement were understood, the P-40 relied on older structural philosophies and engine technology. Yet its very simplicity made it reliable under harsh conditions, and pilots who flew both the P-40 and more advanced aircraft often commented that the Warhawk felt solid even when pushed to its limits. This engineering perspective helped shift the narrative. Instead of being viewed as inferior, the P-40 came to be appreciated as a design that fulfilled its intended purpose exceptionally well within the constraints of its time. Historians also highlighted how the aircraft's ruggedness contributed to Allied successes in remote theaters where logistic support was thin. A fighter that could operate in dust, cold, humidity, and rough terrain without constant maintenance had immense strategic value, even if it could not match enemies at high altitude. Private collectors further shaped the aircraft's modern reputation. Beginning in the 1980s, as warbird restoration grew into a major industry, collectors sought out P-40s to rebuild and fly. Restoring a Warhawk often required tracking down parts scattered across the world, negotiating for wrecks, and fabricating missing components. Many restored aircraft flew for the first time in decades, and their return to the sky was celebrated as a revival of history itself. The sound of their Allison engines, once commonplace, became rare and evocative. Airshows invited P-40s to participate in mock dogfights, formation displays, and solo demonstrations. Pilots emphasized how different the aircraft felt compared to modern planes, heavy on the controls, powerful on takeoff, and demanding respect during landing. These living demonstrations allowed people to connect emotionally with the aircraft in a way that static museum displays could not. The P-40 once again inspired awe, not as a weapon but as an artifact that embodied courage, innovation, and human skill. Some restored Warhawks were even used in modern films and documentaries. Hollywood productions set during World War II sought authenticity, and a real P-40 on screen provided a level of realism that digital effects or replicas could not match. These appearances further cemented the aircraft's place in popular culture. Even people unfamiliar with aviation began to recognize the distinctive silhouette and shark mouth of the P-40 through movies, posters, and video games. The Warhawk became not just a historical object but a storytelling symbol. Meanwhile, former air forces that had operated the P-40 increasingly looked back on the aircraft as a foundation of their post-war development. Military historians in countries like Brazil, Chile, Egypt, and China wrote extensively about how the P-40 shaped pilot training, tactical development, and early modernization efforts. The aircraft served as an important transitional step between the basic piston fighters of the interwar years and the jet fighters that transformed global air power in the 1950s. Without affordable and rugged fighters like the P-40 available in the post-war surplus market, many smaller nations would have struggled to build competent air forces. In this sense, the Warhawk played a quiet but essential role in the early Cold War era, even though it never returned to major combat. Today, the number of surviving P-40s remains small, certainly fewer than 100 in flyable condition worldwide, with perhaps a few dozen more preserved in museums. But these survivors have become treasured relics. Each one has a unique history. Some flew with the Flying Tigers, others served in North Africa or the Soviet Union, and many spent their final military years in remote bases before being rediscovered. The restoration community meticulously documents these stories, creating detailed histories for each aircraft that rival the complexity of biographies. Pilots flying restored P-40s today often remark that they feel a sense of responsibility, knowing they are not just flying a machine but carrying forward the memory of those who once depended on it in life-or-death situations. Modern restorations sometimes go beyond historical accuracy to incorporate discrete safety upgrades. Stronger materials, updated fuel systems, and improved engine components allow these aircraft to fly safely in today's conditions while maintaining the appearance of their wartime configuration. Some restored Warhawks participate in high-profile air races or long-distance flights, demonstrating that the aircraft, despite being more than 80 years old, still retains impressive performance when properly maintained. Owners frequently speak of the emotional connection they feel with the aircraft, describing it as a living piece of history rather than an object. The continued fascination with the Curtiss P-40 also reflects a broader human interest in the early years of World War II. Unlike the technologically advanced aircraft of the later war, the P-40 represents a period when nations were still scrambling to adapt, innovate, and survive. Its pilots often flew at a disadvantage, relying on training, teamwork, and courage rather than superior machines. This underdog narrative resonates strongly with audiences. The Flying Tigers, in particular, became legendary not only for their combat effectiveness but for their daring spirit and unconventional operations. The P-40's shark mouth became associated with determination in the face of overwhelming odds, and this symbolism remains potent today. In many ways, the post-war story of the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk mirrors the journey of many wartime artifacts, forgotten during moments of rapid technological progress, rediscovered later as symbols of history and identity. What makes the P-40 exceptional is the depth of its revival. Few aircraft that were considered obsolete as early as 1944 have re-entered public consciousness with such strength generations later. The Warhawk achieved this not by being the fastest or most advanced, but by embodying an era of struggle and transformation. Its return to the skies decades after the war speaks to a universal desire to preserve tangible connections to the past. When a restored P-40 takes off, even for a short demonstration flight, spectators witness something that transcends mechanical motion. They hear the same engine note that pilots heard in desert battles, Pacific outposts, and Chinese valleys. They see the same silhouette that appeared in countless wartime photographs. For a moment, history becomes alive rather than distant. Museums and airshow organizers understand this emotional power and often place P-40s in central roles in commemorative events. The aircraft reminds audiences of a time when the world was divided, uncertain, and struggling, but also full of courage, ingenuity, and resilience. Even in academic circles, the P-40 remains a subject of study. Researchers continue to analyze its performance characteristics using modern computational tools, comparing historical reports with aerodynamic simulations. These studies help clarify long-standing debates about the aircraft's strengths and limitations. They also highlight how wartime innovation often required rapid, pragmatic decisions rather than ideal engineering solutions. The P-40 serves as a case study in how an aircraft with modest performance could still make enormous contributions when paired with the right tactics and operational environment. Looking at the global spread of the P-40 after the Second World War reveals an often overlooked part of aviation history. The movement of surplus fighters shaped the development of dozens of air forces during the late 1940s and early 1950s. The Warhawk, because of its availability, ruggedness, and relative simplicity, played an outsized role in this period. In many nations, it became the first modern fighter flown by an entire generation of pilots who later transitioned into jets. These post-war roles may lack the drama of wartime dogfights, but they had equally profound impacts on global aviation. The Warhawk's final legacy lies not in metal or machinery but in memory. Pilots who flew it, mechanics who serviced it, historians who studied it, and enthusiasts who restored it all contributed to a collective narrative that spans continents and decades. The aircraft, once dismissed as obsolete, has become a cherished symbol of endurance. Its survival against odds, political, technological, and environmental, mirrors the survival of the stories it carries. When people see a P-40 today, they see more than a fighter plane. They see the determination of early war pilots, the challenges of global conflict, the rapid pace of technological change, and the passion of preservationists who refuse to let history disappear. The journey of the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk after World War II is, therefore, a story of transformation. From frontline fighter to surplus scrap, from forgotten relic to cultural icon, the aircraft has lived multiple lives. It served in the militaries of nations rebuilding after conflict. It appeared in films and airshows. It inspired engineers, historians, and enthusiasts alike. Most importantly, it became a bridge between generations, a reminder that even machines, when tied to human experience, can possess enduring meaning. Today, when a P-40 taxis onto a runway, its engine rumbling, its shark mouth grinning beneath the propeller, it represents not just the past but the preservation of memory. The aircraft that once struggled to compete with more advanced fighters has outlasted many of them in public consciousness. This unexpected outcome reflects the deep emotional connection people feel toward aircraft that played vital roles during moments of profound global change. The Curtiss P-40 Warhawk did not end its story in 1945, it simply began a new chapter, one defined not by war, but by remembrance.